Hello and welcome to Varn Vlog Solo, where we do all kinds of things. And we're returning to our Word is Politics series and continuing our discussions of Plato. I've decided for this series that I'm going to do all three Platonic works in some detail. Well, all three Platonic works being all three political Platonic works. And I didn't talk about the scholarly periodization of Plato, and this is a modern scholarly periodization. This comes from the middle of the 20th century. But classicists tend to divide Plato into three distinct periods: early, middle, and late. How convenient. This division is based off of stylometry, which is a statistical analysis of shifting grammar, vocabulary, and prose rhythm, as well as changes in philosophical themes and philosophical views. We don't know the exact calendar dates of composition for most of these works. They are impossible to pin down. But the thematic and stylistic shifts of these periods are fairly coherent, and so we can talk about them. Early Plato is generally considered to be written between 399 BCE and 387 BCE, and they were written following the execution of Socrates. These dialogues focus heavily on preserving Socrates' method of questioning and his ethical concerns. These works are typically aphoretic, meaning that they deal with the state of aphoria or puzzlement, and they are not aiming at a definitive answer to all the questions that they raise, just to model in a classical dialectic form specific virtues and what they could mean and how one would reason about them. Socrates tends to be the protagonist in these early works, and he claims to know nothing. There is no elaborate metaphysical framework that is clear outside of maybe a beginnings of the theory of the forms, and the works generally considered part of the early Socratic period are the Apology, the Credo, the Euphophro, the Charminides, Laches, Pythagoras, Gorgias, and some people consider the first book of the Republic, because many scholars think that the first book of the Republic was originally published as a dialogue called Thrasymachus, because there is a reference to a dialogue called Thrasymachus that we don't have, and it seems to overlap with the beginning of the Republic. Then there is the middle period, which is generally considered to be between 387 BCE and 360 BCE. This period begins after Plato's trip to Sicily, where it seems like he was influenced by Pythagoreans. And it also coincides with the founding of the Academy in Athens. And Plato moves away from mere questioning others and begins to constructing a positive systematic doctrines. He introduces some key metaphysical theories, including the theory of the form in this time period. This is also where the most explicitly political works come into being. Although, as we'll talk about when we talk about interpretations of the Republic may not just be a political work. Socrates is still the main interlocutor, but he is now not just doing his questioning methodology, but actually is sharing Plato's views on epistemology, metaphysics, and politics, at least as we know them from other writings about the Academy. The prose is also more polished and more poetic, with more famous myths and allegories coming from it, including things like Atlantis. The works that are included in this time period are the Republic. At least books 2 to 10 are considered part of it. The Meno, the Phaedo, the Symposium, Phaedrus, Cratylus, and Parmenides, which is where Plato actually critiques his own theory of the form, and it falls apart. This leads to the late period, of which two of the explicitly political writings are from. Plato's final decades were marked by intense self-criticism and a second and third disastrous trip to Syracuse, which were attempts to try to turn the tyrant Dionysius II into a philosopher king, which failed. And you have the deep institutionalization of the academy in this time period. And this is a time period between 360 BCE to 357 BCE. The tone becomes much more technical, much more analytical, and a lot drier. Plato focuses on logic, classifications of taxonomies of concepts, particularly methods of collection and divisions, and detailed writings on institutions, cosmology, and constitutions. Socrates is no longer as much of a key player in these dialogues, and some of the dialogues he's just mentioned as being there, but is not even speaking. In the laws, he's not mentioned at all. The focus shifts from abstract perfect ideals to how these ideals can be initiated or approximated in our world, which is imperfect. And these major works include the Sophist, the Statesman, Phoebus, Timaeus, which is his cosmology and epistemology, Critias, and the Laws. While it's important to note that these three-period model remains fairly standard, contemporary scholarship has grown somewhat more cautious about over-rigid separations of them. There are strong transition periods between the three periods. If you look at the early dialogues, there does seem to be hints of the metaphysical dialogues you see in the middle and late periods. They're just hinted at, they're not as explicit. Pedagogical statements of themes are stated more explicitly in the early stuff. The works seem to be educational. So later stuff seems to be more theoretical. However, again, that distinction seems somewhat maybe overdetermined, because in some ways all of the surviving works of Plato are his public works. They're the public dialogues. We don't have a lot of like the notes and other things that you see that you actually get with Aristotle. But it's important to note that while there are political themes in all periods of Plato, the more mature, completely political texts, the Republic of Politia, the Statesmen of the Politicos, and the Laws of the Nomoi, are all from the middle to late period. Generally, the Statesmen of the Politicos are considered in a transitional period in Plato's development, but all of them are from later Platonic works. So we need some background on the Republic. It helps to treat the Republic not just as an abstract political theory, but as something that is responding to a few different things. One, Plato's development of a, frankly, somewhat esoteric philosophical school. Two, this insistence on the reflection as above, so below. And three, the breakdown of Athenian society during and after the Peloponnesian War, which is a context for Socrates in the first place, and particularly that war from 431 to 404 BCE. Plato was writing in the ruins of a democratic empire, trying to figure out why his city had turned into civil and social wars, as well as a disastrous war between the Hellenes. The context behind these dialogues can be understood through a couple of different layers. There's a historical crisis, there's a personal trauma of Socrates' death, and the intellectual background of 4th century Athens. Plato was born right at the beginning of the Peloponnesian War. So it defined the first 2 decades of his life. The conflict was between a democratic Athens and an oligarchic Sparta. He grew up witnessing the plague of Athens, which was a devastating epidemic that killed a third of the population. It shattered civic morals and took the life of Pericles, who was one of the greatest leaders of the democratic period of Athenian development. He watched Athenian democracy get swayed by populist and demagogues like Alcibiades, of who we talked about, had a weirdly problematic relationship with Socrates himself, which led to disastrous military decisions and war crimes like the slaughter at Melios. Then, when Sparta defeated Athens, they installed an oligarchic puppet regime led by the 30 Athenian aristocrats, including Plato's own relatives, Critias and Charminides, which we've already mentioned, and the political backgrounds of Plato video before this. They executed roughly 1,500 citizens, which in this time period would have been a huge amount. We're talking about way fewer people in the world than we are now. So Plato is dealing with watching both a radical democracy and a reactionary oligarchy installed by a competitive regime in the Hellenic world descend into bloodbaths. And Plato seems to have arrived at the conclusion that all existing regimes in the Hellenic world were already corrupt. It's hard to understate also as a context for Republic, the context for most of Plato's work. It seems like the pivotal event of Plato's literary life anyway, and maybe his actual life, occurred when they restored Athenian democracy after the oligarchs put his mentor Socrates to death on clearly chumped up charges of impiety and corrupting the youth, partially due to Socrates' own relationship with the oligarchs. I mean, we've talked about how Critias, Charminides, and Alcibiades were all, in some ways, tied to Socrates, Alcibiades in particular. Plato seemed to view this as the ultimate systemic failure. If we're supposed to read Socrates as the most just man who ever lived, how could he be legally executed by a democracy simply for asking questions? Then the legal and political architecture of the city was fundamentally broken. But it seems like Plato, for all of his aristocratic leanings, which we can talk about, he had a fundamental problem with the political architecture of both the oligarchy and the democracy. Thus, the Republic is in many ways an extended monument to Socrates. Its basic question is, what kind of city-state would be safe for a man like Socrates to live? And the answer is the Heliopolis, the city of the philosophers, where the philosopher kings are in charge so they can't face execution. But there's also a lot more going on here because the Republic works on many different levels. It is also a metaphor for the journey of the soul. It is also, or at least that's what a lot of Neoplatonists thought, as well as some early Islamic thinkers. It is also esoteric in ways that are not easy to parse out. You can listen to The Secret History of Western Esotericism for more on this. And it is also in contention with the sophists. Plato is waging war against the sophists, who are professional teachers of rhetoric, who charge fees, sometimes high fees, to teach ambitious young men how to win arguments in a democratic assembly. Sophists like Thrasymachus, who appears in Book 1, and as we said, Book 1 may have been its own dialogue for a while, argued that justice is merely the advantage of the stronger, Nietzsche style, or Nietzsche style, before people get all on me for not pronouncing my German correctly. Moral laws are just conventions, are nomos, invented by the weak to hold back the strong, or by the strong to exploit the weak, according to Tracy Makis. And so Plato saw this moral relativism as an ideological disease, and he attributed it, like many idealists, to what caused the collapse of Athens. The Republic thus works as a many-layered guidebook and metaphor to defeat the cynicism of Tracy Makis, proving that justice is rooted in something eternal, some physis, or basis of reality, and also is reflective of the human soul and the heavens, as above, so below, as without, so within. All these occult things that you may know from like medieval alchemy, a lot of it starts here. The conversation is set during a brief lull in the Peloponnesian War, and this is important. That's when this imagined dialogue between Socrates and Tracy Makis is supposed to have happened at the home of Polemarchus in the Piraeus, which was the democratic port district of Athens. Everything seems peaceful, but readers at the time would know the irony. Nearly every character in the room would meet a violent death and political purges just a few years later. They are picked as speakers, partly because they're not going to live. Now, Plato writes this decades later. We know this happens after he's traveled the Mediterranean, after he was studying Pythagorean geometry, and whatever other mystical shit is tied into Pythagorean geometry, which is its whole debate that I'm not going to go into today. And after the founding of the academy. So he is looking back at a prior epoch that he lived through and trying to build an intellectual fortress that prevents the tragedy that he's implying is about to happen because of the result of the Peloponnesian War from ever happening again. That's the backdrop. That's the dramatic setting. That's when it is written. We don't know the exact date. We have a good reason to believe it was written between 380 and 375 BCE. Now, who was Tracy Makis, and why does it matter so damn much? In Book 1 of the Republic, Tracy Makis enters like a wild beast. He is portrayed as aggressive, competitive, deeply cynical about the intellectual climate of 5th century BCE Athens. As a historical figure, Tracy Makis of Chalcedon, I always forget those are case, of Chalcedon, was a celebrated teacher of rhetoric, really famous actually. And within the Plato's dramatic framework, he's the avatar of the sophist movement because he was one of the most famous people. Specifically, its late phase, in its radical phase, where the sophists dominated the coaching of politics for the various orators during the Peloponnesian War. Thus, Tracy Makis represents a movement across 3 different axes. The reduction of justice to power in a democratic framework, the weaponization of language itself, and a move away from true function or meaning, and the shift from traditional Greek morality to what to Plato seemed like egoism. The first central debate is physis versus nomos, a reality versus convention. And the central debate among the sophists here was that the tension between physis or physics or nature or natural law, like logos, it has a bunch of different translations, and nomos, which is like law, custom, or convention, although logos can also mean law, but it means word or logic, law in a different sense. Traditional Greek piety held that laws were divinely sanctioned or they were rooted in natural law or natural justice. They emerged from the way that human beings already were. You can see this reflected and expanded upon in a way, actually, by the teleological thinking of Aristotle. But he didn't invent this, he refined it and formalized it. It kind of was a notion in Hellenic thinking, period. And it plays a big important because this idea of natural law is taken by Christian thinkers and Islamic thinkers and Jewish thinkers, maybe even late Zoroastrian thinkers. That one is a little bit more up in the air. I've been reading more in Zoroastrianism lately. I might actually cover it in this series. I don't know. It might be beyond my pay grade, though. I don't have a strong grasp of Middle Persian literature. But anyway. So Tracy Mackes famously says justice is nothing other than the advantage of the stronger. And Tracy Mackes' view, and we don't know that if Tracy Mackes actually held this view. He may be being caricatured. Whoever holds power in the city, whether it be a tyranny, an oligarchy, or democracy, passes laws to preserve their own rule. Therefore, just is only a code for what the ruler wants, and obedience to the law is not a moral virtue. It is simply a high-minded naivete on the part of the weak who are being successfully exploited by the strong. If this sounds like Nietzsche, it's for a reason. Nietzsche read this and decided that he sided with Tracy Mackes and the sophist explicitly. But this is something that you heard from other documents of the time period. If you look at the Melian dialogue and Thucydides during the Peloponnesian Wars, and Athenian generals are noted to have told the Melians that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. So while he's putting it in Tracy Mackes' mouth, we have this statement from other people that we can trust as being a guiding principle of how the Athenian elites treated non-Athenians in war, at minimum. For Socrates, dialogue and dialectic, which almost mean the same thing, is a collaborative search for the truth, for physis, for objective truth. And it requires humility and a shared admission of ignorance of all involved. Even though for Socrates, he also has kind of an innate idea that if you admit ignorance, in the ignorance, you will find that you actually already know everything, even if you are an uneducated slave boy. See Timaeus for that. I think that's Timaeus. That's both cosmology and epistemology. So I think it's Timaeus. Anyway, for the sophist, a dialogue is agnostic. It's a competitive sport that is aristic, right? It's about battle. You think about, for those of you who know about Discordianism, the god Eris, all right? The goal was to dominate, humiliate, or win accolades. That's all it was function. So Tracy Mackes demonstrates the statistic methodology explicitly. Before he even delivers his definition, he demands that Socrates pay him a fee. This is pointed out in the text because it treats knowledge as a commercial commodity rather than a spiritual pursuit. Tracy Mackes engages in long, sweeping speeches and oratory, then attempts to leave, treating the audience as a passive crowd to be conquered by arrogance, as opposed to the questioning model of Socrates. And Tracy Mackes relies heavily on mockery, sarcasm, and ad hominem attacks, charging Socrates, for example, with being a sycophant and telling him he needs a wet nurse to wipe his nose, rather than logic. To Plato, this was intellectual corruption outright, and it poisoned Athenian democracy by poisoning the rhetoric of the assembly. Policy was not decided by what was true, good, or in the long-term best interest of everyone, but who was the most persuasive and charismatic performer in any given moment, which is part of why Plato distrusted democracy. Now, let's talk about this. Earlier sophists like Protagoras argued for a conventionalist view where nomos, our laws, were necessary to keep society from collapsing in the chaos, but they were artificial. But by the late 5th century, sophists have shifted towards a radical individualism centered on pleonexia, which is an innate desire to get more than one's fair share. It is acquisitive and acquisition. It is about accumulating power. Thrasymachus represents this life stage shift in Socrates' Republic by arguing that the unjust man is happier, wiser, and more effective than any just man because the just man is a rube. He holds up the tyrant, a man who commits injustice on a grand systemic scale, as the ultimate archetype of human happiness and success. Thus, he both claims that justice is relative and that justice, if you believe in it, is a vice. He calls it high-minded simplicity in the text. And that injustice is actually a virtue, being that it is a good counsel. This, according to the Platonic worldview, is an inversion of morality. And Plato is using him to represent the Athenian elites who had discarded any traditional civic virtue in favor of unconstrained self-interest, wealth, and political domination. By having Socrates counter Thrasymachus in Book 1 and what was probably originally an independent dialogue, Plato is setting the stakes for the remaining 9 books of the Republic. Thrasymachus is silenced by the end of Book 1, but his underlining challenge that morality is a scam run by the powerful hangs over the entire work. And it's not even that all descendants of Socrates would disagree with them. The Cyrenaics, for example, in Cyrene, aka Libya, were also what we often accuse Epicureans of being, which is pleasure hedonists who also thought that power was its own reward. Now, the rest of the Republic is a dialogue by Glaucon and Adeimantus, which ends up with people demanding that Socrates provide a metaphysical refutation of Thrasymachus' worldview to prove that justice is intrinsically valuable to both the human soul and could be manifested in the world in a practicable way, regardless of power, reputation, or reward of those involved. And that is where the Republic really begins. We'll come back to the books of the Republic in our next video on the topic. This might be a long series, so I'm going to take occasional breaks and cover other things. And I will make a playlist of all this for all of you. But there's a lot to study here. And I do think for me, it's a nice break from always talking about 19th century and early 20th century Marxism. So we'll enjoy it. I actually really like studying the ancient world. I'll probably read more about it than Marxist stuff. I mean, you can't really see that, but Greek stuff, Greek poetry, it's all back there. I have my classics wall, and oh my God, my classics on my Kindle, as well as all the secondary and tertiary sources on it. This was where my passion I had 3 passions as an undergrad. Believe it or not, early modern literature. So like Shakespeare up and through Tristram Shandy. Philosophy, particularly ancient philosophy, but also of the 18th and 19th century Germans. So obsessed with Hegel and Fichte and Marx and Nietzsche and Schiller and all those guys. And religious philosophy, and then some interest in the philosophy of science. That's actually where my intellectual interests were in my 20s, and they haven't ever completely gone away. I become hyper specialized in Marxism because my political world ties up into that, But I do think we have to deal with Plato as its own thing, and then deal with which of these frameworks that I mentioned in the prior video we might apply to these, because there's a bunch of ways Marxists or socialists or leftists or liberals could approximate and deal with Plato today. But I want to make sure that you understand that one of the problems I have with the contemporary teaching of Plato is the context of Plato is often stripped out, and it's treated as a sui generis text that is almost completely self-contained. And I don't think you can read Plato that way. I am a historicist, and more than just the historical materialist sense, that I think actually having the historical context is important for being able to reconstruct what this has meant in the past. Now, that doesn't limit what you can use it for now, but it is important to think about that as we move forward with the text. As always, I will put some readings for you to do in addition in the show notes, and I hope you protect your peace.